This is a disaster risk reduction and emergency management, depending on where you're using it, but by and large, it's disaster risk reduction principle. There are 5 pillars in this. This theory is generally used, it's used in all 3, but we're going to use it mostly in a disaster risk reduction context when we're talking about this. So there's 5 kind of like pillars or sections when you're dealing with really, really bad events that happen. In sort of order, you've got prevention, you've got mitigation, you've got preparedness, you've got response, and you've got recovery. In a disaster, in an emergency management sort of context, these would be viewed as phases. So if you have a flood, preventing a flood would be sort of a phase or a section where you would do things to make it so the flood doesn't happen. Mitigation would be sort of the phase where you do stuff to try to build things to make it so the flood is less bad at hitting you, or is less bad. An example of this would be like a watershed or a dam system, stuff like that, to try to redirect the water or change elevations. That's usually a mitigation sort of process. So like when the water comes, less of it will hit you. Prevention would, for example, would generally be, well, we're just going to build on higher ground so the river isn't going to get to us, something like that. Because you can't flood because you're too high up from river water. You could still flood from rainwater, but those are different risks. We'll get into that later. So, because water is not the same. But anyways, so you have, once again, prevention, you have mitigation, then you have preparedness. The preparedness phase is about not getting startled. So when something highly irregular happens, but that's something that people aren't used to, preparedness is there to make it so you don't panic and make really, really bad decisions, or so that your bad decisions are less bad or whatever. So your decisions are better. The goal there, so usually you're looking at like training, planning, sitting in a classroom and then learning about a thing, educating people on how earthquakes work. So Japan does this really well. They educate in as little as kindergarten their kids and their population about earthquakes. So earthquake drills, get under the desk and all that whole thing. That's all preparedness, so that when the thing happens, they know what to do. Is that going to stop the earthquake? No. Is it going to mitigate the damage of the earthquake? Well, kind of, but not really. So is it going to make it so the population makes more intelligent decisions when the thing happens? That's the point, okay? Because their panic is going to be directed instead of just, what do I do? That's preparedness. That's the idea. Kind of by definition, watching these videos is a preparedness effort because you're learning about a thing. Generally speaking, any sort of learning is pretty much going to be a preparedness exercise. Okay, you've got response. Response is like police, fire, and ambulance is one thing that comes, those are emergency responders, right? That comes to people's mind. But response is the thing you do right after the thing happens. So there's an incident, there's a lightning strike, there's a flood, there's a whatever. What do you do immediately? After the flood, when there's a flood, you're talking about sandbags and buckets. Okay, let's get the water out. You're talking about dealing with the water as it happens. Okay, we're not talking about recovering from the water. We're talking about the water is here. I need to do something about it right now. Now, sandbags are a response measure because you're putting them in place when you know the water is coming. If you put sandbags in place like 3 days prior and you built an artificial sort of dam, that would be mitigation largely. Okay, so I'm talking about it's coming, let's go right now. A fire extinguisher is a response tool. An automatic sprinkler system is automated response. Now, you might have to train somebody on a fire extinguisher, right? You might have to ensure that the automated sprinkler system works and test it. Those are preparedness things you do to make sure the response is more effective. But the response is the stuff you do right after. Now, I'll get into why you need to care about all this in a second, but because I get for some people this might be long-winded, but trust me, this is important. Recovery. And this is a phrasing that some people who remember COVID will not like, but this is what we've been calling it for way before COVID. This is about getting back to the new normal. And I know how new normal sounds, but this is an emergency management and like a disaster risk reduction sort of principle. So no surprise, you heard of some of the language from this industry come up in a major global pandemic, a disaster, right? The idea is that when something of a significant impact happens, you try to get back to normal, or if that's not realistically possible, you try to get back to a new normal, whatever that's going to be. So when you're looking at a new normal, there are decisions you can make. You can build back to the way it was originally, or you can do something that we call building back better. Build Back Better was a legislation bill in a few countries as well. That's the same wording, and same kind of idea, but I'm not talking about specific legislation here. The principle behind Build Back Better is, look, something just destroyed whatever it was. If we're going to have to rebuild it anyways, we might as well upgrade it. That's the idea behind a sort of like a Build Back Better strategy. Now, with recovery, you can do Build Back Better. You can do return to what it was. You can also, and this is important, you can do assume the loss. Now, assume the loss is always a strategy that should be considered. Now, you can consider it and reject it quickly if it's not viable, but it should be considered because at minimum you want to rule it out. You want to know why you're not just assuming the loss. There are a lot of instances where organizations or people were better off just assuming the loss and basically moving on from whatever it was. In a business example, you could have a part of your company that if it was gone, you would just outsource it. Like you just wouldn't bring it back, right? You have a major loss of that resource, whatever. That part of the building burns down. You only have 3 employees left in that whole department, and they're all getting a bit older and they all retire, and then you just don't replace them. You're assuming the loss, right? You're just, okay, next. I'm not going there. In a family example, looking at recovery, one way that you can look at this sort of process and then kind of work through it would be succession planning. So this is often a very dark conversation that people don't want to have with their kids, but the conversation of what do we do if mommy and daddy aren't around anymore, right? That whole conversation. It doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this, which I might get into later. I might make a separate video for that one specifically. But basically, this is a relevant question. It's going to matter at some point. We are limited by time. We don't have a choice. How does one manage the risk of loss of family member? Well, we can't prevent it entirely. That's impossible. We can mitigate it, sure. We can definitely, do sorts of health things and whatever to try to mitigate that, to kind of extend it, yes. We can mitigate it because the older we get, the more prepared we're probably going to be to move on from that. Generally speaking, a 30-year-old is more effective at living on their own than a 2-year-old. You could prepare for it by having conversations about, well, if we're not around, do this. One example of this would be like running a preparedness drill for mommy and daddy not being around. Is mommy and daddy go on a cruise and then the kids fend for themselves when they're a bit older, and then you figure out if you come back to your house being a disaster zone, because that's what happened when you weren't around, right? So that's not as dark and evil. It's like, oh, we're on vacation, deal with it. And then if they, figure it out and you don't come back to a disaster zone, then it looks like you can, you're a bit more secure. It's like, oh, they might be okay without me, So there's that. Then, response. How does one respond to loss of a family member? Well, usually that's with a lot of crying, grief, and figuring out how expensive funerals are. That's not very pleasant. And then for recovery, well, you're kind of not getting back to normal. You're probably doing new normal, right? And there's some degree of assume the loss that you're going to have to do because, I suppose with AI and robots, we could make replacements, but that's just getting weird for me. It's just, so it's like sometimes you just can't recover the thing. Right? So these are things we have to deal with, and you're better off not being completely surprised by it and having a system to address it at all. Okay, simple version of each thing. Prevention. Make it so thing don't happen. Mitigation. Make it so thing happen less. Preparedness. Don't be surprised by thing. Response. Deal with thing as it happens. Recovery. Get back to new normal after thing because thing was really unfortunate. Okay, right? That's the basic idea. Simplified version. Why does this matter? Why are we going to be using this? When it comes time to getting yourself in a headspace to think about this stuff, if you think about a given risk, a given thing that you're dealing with, there's always going to be something you can do in each category. Now, it might not be practical depending on the thing and which category, but when it comes to brainstorming solutions, when it comes to identifying what we're going to do about the thing, there's always going to be an idea. So when you end up kind of making like a chart and then writing things down and then going, okay, hey, you know what are we going to do for this? So, families looking at, a family wants to look, and this could be a business, could be anything, but I'm going to use the family example because if it works for a family, it works for a multinational. A family wants to look at fire, the house catching on fire. Hey, this family member, you can take prevention. This family member, you can take, mitigation, in each. And then they can each come back with brainstorming on, okay, how can I prevent this? So how can I prevent the fire? Well, we're not going to smoke inside. Well, we're not going to, play with light sockets in a weird way. Well, we're going to make sure that we don't do we're not going to, cook with a barbecue inside that, whatever. Like we're going to not do these things so the fire can't start in the first place. Great. How do I do mitigation? Bunch of different lists. How am I going to do? And like the mitigation suggestion might be from somebody, we're going to fireproof our walls. And the parents go, I'm not paying the rental for that. but it was an idea. So they were thinking. They're in the headspace. When it comes to coming up with solutions later for this, with continuity, if you're in this headspace and you're thinking this way, you come up with way more ideas. And they're, generally speaking, better targeted. So the chance of them being more effective, in my experience, is much higher because the headspace is more targeted. That's kind of one of the big things with this. And when we look at risk management specifically and the risk matrix, not the matrix. So when we look at the risk matrix, there are sections of it where, depending on where a risk lands, a certain strategy will be the thing you want to target. And other things will just because of how risks work, will be more likely to be a waste of your time. So you can just kind of eliminate things that probably won't work right out the gate and say, we're going to focus on this sort of stuff because it makes sense. So thinking in this way helps you kind of not waste your time trying to find solutions that probably won't work or that won't be effective enough for what you're doing. So when I first started doing this, one of the immediate feedback I got was, this sounds very theory-based, or, this sounds like, why isn't this practical? And then a few hours in, because when I'm doing this sort of thing in a consulting with an organization, it's usually, a day, 2 days, and we're just like going through 8 months of work basically in 2 days. And at the start, it's like, I'm not sure. About 1 or 2 hours in, they go, oh, I get why you did that now. Oh, so I suspend the disbelief for a moment. It will make sense. There will be light bulb moments, hopefully. There have been when I've done this with virtually every client. Once again, there's probably some client where there wasn't a light bulb moment, but I can't think of one. So this stuff has just worked. I don't like saying absolute statements because they're inaccurate, but yeah. Okay.